they basically steal the women. So this is called the rape of the Sabines. And yeah, it's so the women are kept. The Sabines come back and they want to get the women away, but by the time they come back, the women have suffered Stockholm syndrome. And so they say, no, please don't kill these people. We think of them as our husbands now, and we're happy to be Roman women instead. And so, so then, everything's sort of happily ever after for a while, but nobody's getting pregnant. And everybody sort of goes, Romulus laments, and he says, if I knew that you weren't going to get pregnant, I would have never stolen you in the first place. And they go to this special grove that is sacred to Juno Lucina. So Juno Lucina is Juno, the queen of the gods, in her incarnation as the goddess of childbirth. So they go there, they're lamenting, and they hear a voice in the woods say to them, Hircus inito, which basically means if the women want to become pregnant, then they need to let a goat mount them. So let yourselves be fucked by a goat, and you can have children.
A very good sentence to walk in on.
There you go. I'm just glad to have that connection. So the women are horrified by this, but there's an Etruscan priest who happens to be there, and he says, no. What the spooky ghost voice meant was that we need to sacrifice a goat and then hit you all with goat leather that comes from the sacrificed goat, and that will be enough. And so all the women say, oh, thank God. Like, you kind of have to wonder, like, is that anchor pricing? Was that like, these women are not going to be whipped with goat thongs. Like, let's give them a much worse version and then pull it back, right? So, so that is part of the sort of founding story. There's a lot of goaty stuff that's also built into the Lupercalia. Juno, in her Etruscan form, is often depicted as goat-headed or wearing a goat hat. That's just like a goat head on her head. Yeah, for folks who have come in, feel free to ask any questions. I'm happy to chat about anything. Oh, I see. Okay, so Nixie has asked. So you mentioned Arcadia is a place that Greeks believe was the oldest place in the world. I remember reading the concept of Arcadia as paradise. So Arcadia comes to occupy a really weird position in the Greek and the Roman imagination. So Arcadia is where the old and the spooky and the original, religion and magic stuff is. It's also where the hillbillies are, right? So it's seen as being a backward place. It's not a place of culture and of civilization and of sort of urban life that gets praised by most Greeks and Romans. But it does develop this strong association because of the hillbilly stuff and because of the sort of peasant, old-fashioned, this is what we were back in the olden days when we were cave people shepherds. Because of those associations, eventually it gets associated strongly with what's called bucolic poetry. And bucolic poetry is poetry that has to do with shepherds or with cowherds. And often bucolic poetry is set in Arcadia, but a fictional version of Arcadia that is like idealized. It's kind of it's paradisical in a lot of ways. But it's also full of heartbreak and sadness and slavery. Like often the singers in bucolic poetry are enslaved shepherds, and they're just trying to make it. And often they're singing love songs of lament for somebody that they fell in love with that just won't it's unrequited love. So there's a famous version by Theocritus, who's a Greek writer in the 3rd century. Who basically is the sort of father of bucolic poetry. And he says that the Cyclops Polyphemus that we all know and love from Homer's Odyssey, right, the guy that Odysseus blinds to get out of his cave, that before that happens, Polyphemus was a shepherd. He had a lot of sheep. That's a sort of core part of the story in the Odyssey. And before he's blinded, he falls in love with this nymph named Galatea, but he's sad because, Galatea is really pretty and he's kind of ugly and plain. And he sings this lament song about how like, oh, Galatea, I know that I don't look that great, but, I try to take care of my eyebrow. My one eyebrow. I got lots of milk and lots of wool, and you can be happy with me. And it's kind of funny, like, making this monstrous figure seem really kind of sympathetic and sad and experiencing things that we've all experienced. So, yeah, so it's sometimes paradise and sometimes it's sort of dark. The thing that happens in later reception in like the 18th and 19th century is this idea, et in Arcadia ego. So this is a Latin phrase that means even in Arcadia, I exist. And it's a phrase that's spoken by death. So even in Arcadia, even in paradise, there is still death. Still you can die, and that death is permanent and an invariable part of your life, even in the best circumstances. So yeah, thanks for that question. That was great.
Actually, so I was wondering, because werewolf is more of an anachronistic term we kind of applied to what the Greeks and Romans had with the werewolf shapeshifters. Was there a specific term the Greeks and Romans use for these types of wolf shapeshifters?
Yeah, let me go ahead and put it.
Because I know the Romans used the term verispelli for some types of shapeshifters, but I'm not sure if that applied to all animal shapeshifting or wolves specifically.
Yeah. So Worsipellis means somebody who changes their skin, and it is the catch-all term for anybody who can turn into some other thing. Most of the time, when Greek and Roman authors are talking about Worsipellis, what they're talking about is animal transformation. Often, it's not werewolfy stuff so much as it is witchy stuff. So witches can turn themselves into owls and fly away and spy on people. People can get turned into donkeys as punishment for things. And that's an example of, these figures are also Worsipelles. So werewolf is a small subcategory underneath Worsipelles. So in general, when Greek authors talk about werewolves, there's a good kind of boring book by Daniel Ogden called The Ancient Werewolf. Came out like 3 years ago. And he has a really nice sort of discussion of the relationship between witches and wolves and some of the vocabulary that we see with shapeshifters and with animal transformation. And it's interesting that in a lot of Greek authors, they just use the word for wolf, right? So it's not that this is something distinctive as a different category between human and wolf. It's just when you look like a wolf, you are a wolf, and when you look like a human, you are a human.
Hey, I got here just in time for werewolf chat.
Yeah, werewolf time. Woo. So that's sometimes we see the word lycanthropos where we get lycanthropy from, and so that's just wolfman. That's much rarer than just lukos than wolf, or lupa in Latin. Yeah, great question.
Well, I'm actually curious, is there a connection with these more ancient Roman werewolves and the Benedonti that were in northern Italy afterwards?
That is a good question, and that's something that I don't know. So that goes outside of my chronological expertise. I would guess yes, because folk traditions just kind of have a way of carrying on and developing, right? So like Italian comic traditions in the 16th century are fundamentally the same traditions that Greek and Roman comic authors are doing. It's just had time to change and develop a little bit. So that, my guess is maybe is probably there's a lot of stuff that's similar, and there's a lot of stuff that is part of novel development as part of folklore construction. But I have no idea. I'm speaking from zero knowledge.
So your range is mostly the Greek and Roman world, right?
Yeah. So my knowledge starts dropping off around the 6th century BC, 6th century CE, and my specialty area is between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE. So a lot of what we looked at today is from that period, from the late Republic or the early Imperial period.
Because I know contemporary to that period, you also had a lot of Germanic and Celtic tribes that had different versions of their own wolf shapeshifters. Some of them very similar to like the Berserkers would see with the Norse. Was there any connection or overlap as well, sharing these different types of stories?
That's a really good question. So, so the short answer is yes. The longer answer is it's all really fuzzy and hard to pick apart. We know that there is a ton of interaction between Gallic culture and Roman culture, so sort of Proto-French and Roman culture, Germanic and Roman culture. So the folks who are sort of in Germany, Switzerland, all the way up into into the southern Scandinavian countries, and the Iberian Peninsula, so Spain and Portugal, is populated largely by Celts in the Roman period. And often we see the sort of the ethnonym is they're Celtiberians, they're Celtic people who live in the Iberian Peninsula. And yeah, so there's a lot of cultural kind of pushing back and forth that we see, especially starting around this period, like cultural contact that endures between Gauls and Romans really sort of takes off in the middle/end of the 1st century BCE. It's a consequence of Julius Caesar, basically. Like Caesar went and committed war crimes and enslaved a ton of Celts, a ton of Gauls, and added Gaul to the sort of Roman portfolio. But in general, like Romans have this practice of not interfering with local religious traditions and local magic traditions. So they just do this kind of it's called sometimes it's called translatio Graeca or translatio Latina. So basically just they find the rough equivalent in Roman culture and they say, oh, okay, you say blibbity blorp, and blibbity blorp for you is the god of messengers and money. Well, that's our Mercury, so you call him blibbity blorp, we call him Mercury, he's the same dude, you can keep calling him whatever. And then we get a lot of syncretism, a lot of just like stuff starts mushing together. And there are some really interesting stories. There are really interesting like Roman representations of Druidic practice that is real hazy. There's some interesting representations of Gallic practice, Gallic Celtic practice, and there's interesting animal stuff. There's a fun Gallic story where Caesar's up in Gaul, and the Gauls convince Caesar that there's this special magical animal that is, like a deer, but it's too fast to be caught by anybody. And the way that you catch it is you have to saw through halfway through every tree in the woods. And this deer likes to lean against trees. And so eventually it's going to lean against a tree that you've sawed in half and will fall over. And then once it falls over, it's like a turtle, it can't get up. And so, and I wonder sometimes, like, is this the Gallic, like, look at this asshole, he's taken all our stuff, like, let's put him on a wild goose chase? Or is this part of, a Gallic tradition that's being mediated through a Roman source? So.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely want to poke you later because I'm actually been working on a short fantasy story about a werewolf in the Roman legion who ends up fighting Germanic tribes and finds out they're a completely different type of wolf shapeshifter. So, yeah,
anytime, ping me anytime. Happy to chat. I'm teaching my Beast Lit class right now, so I've got a bunch of students who are doing werewolfy stuff. Last time I taught it, one student did a research paper about the trope of werewolf boyfriend. And so, like, eroticism and romanticism in werewolf things was a interesting deep dive. So yeah, happy to chat anytime. There's cool stuff. Any questions? Any other questions? So
yeah, if you have other questions, we have a valuable resource here. He definitely gives my TF panels a run for my money because very well researched in this. Do you actually have any books published? Because I think that would be a great way to just kind of share your information.
Yeah, I do have. I've got one book out right now, so it is. Nobody wants to buy it, but it's sweet of you to plug it.
And also, what do you recommend? Because that's another thing for me, having to research all the folklore for shapeshifting. There's a lot of books out there, but it's very, very hard to know what's a legit academic source and what is, someone making stuff up.
Yeah, that is a really tricky thing. So here I pasted a link to the Google book page for my book. So it's about how a poet in the first century basically uses references to comedy from 2 centuries earlier as a way to communicate with others at a really turbulent time. So it's basically like us using Simpsons references or memes or something, but with this particular genre. And it's about the idea of performance. So the word persona, Romans believe etymologically is personare, it's to sound through. And it's the word for mask. It's the mask that you talk through when you're on stage. And so your persona is whatever mask you're putting on at the time. But yeah, so for sources, it's a lot of it is going to be trial and error. So in general, some good practice for getting reliable sources is if a source has been peer reviewed, and functionally what that means is just has somebody who is a specialist in the field, at least one person, looked at this book before it got published and signed off on it for the most part. And the peer review process is not perfect. A lot of bad stuff gets through publishers. There are a lot of publishers that are, basically fish for reviewers that will just pass a thing through because they want to get it in print. But most reputable academic presses don't do this. Most reputable presses don't do this outside academia as well. And so for my field, the standard is that 2 blind referees, so 2 referees who know who you are, but you don't know who they are, they evaluate your manuscript and they give thumbs up, thumbs down, or they ask for revisions, and and then the editor kind of asks you to do that. So if a book has been peer reviewed, then that is a good way to say at least this is credible. At least this is not a self-published. Like self-published stuff can be perfect, can be amazing and rich and accurate, or it can be total crackpot stuff. And the issue is it's just very difficult to tell between the two. With monographs that are peer reviewed, with books that are peer reviewed, then at least somebody it has passed the crackpot test at least once, and people have put substantial time into verifying that this is on the whole a reasonable thing. How do you identify whether something is peer reviewed or not? That's trickier. The short answer is, if it is an academic press, so if it's a university press, then it's been peer reviewed. That is just a standard practice across the board. Some university presses are better than others. Some are more prestigious than others. Some of them have a much more rigorous process than others. But universally, they all do this.
Alien.
What's that?
No, welcome.
Oh, hello. Yeah, so that's a good way for books. You can also just look if it's a publisher whose name you recognize. Routledge is a big name. Routledge does both sort of public trade books, but also academic books. They also go through a peer review process. Bloomsbury, anything where you can say like, oh, okay, I've seen that on a bookshelf before. I've seen that press before. That can give you a little bit of security. When it comes to articles, so blog posts, microblogging, social media stuff, like this is sometimes a frustrating thing that I have to tell students. Like students want to go and cite a blog post that has been written by, one of my friends and colleagues who I know, who works in the same rough area as I do. I've read the blog. It is 100% accurate. It is a plausible argument, and they are really good, careful researchers. And I have to tell students, like, you can't use this. You can't use this because there's no way for you to differentiate between whether this is fake or real. There's no way. You don't have the knowledge base to do this. You can take my word for it, but I could be lying to you, right? I could be saying, yeah, look at my friend's stuff. I like my friend and want my friend to be cited in student papers, and it'll make them feel good. gold standard. So if an article has been published in an academic journal, it's gone through a process. The same range of reliability and care appears there as with book stuff. So some presses are better than other presses for journals. If you see the name of a journal article that you are interested in, and if the person is alive, you should definitely 100% email that person and say, hey, I saw this journal article and I'd like to read it. Would you mind sending me a copy? 99% of the time, when we get emails like that, we are tickled pink. We just start giggling because that means somebody wants to read this. It's not being read because somebody has to read it because it's been assigned. Like it's a good feeling. And we will give you copies for free. There's a lot of paywalling in academic journals where they'll say like, oh, do you want this article? It's $30, it's $50 or whatever. We don't see a dime of that. So you're not robbing the person who actually did any work. The editor doesn't see a dime from that, except that the press pays them. Authors of articles make zero money. I have never been paid for anything that I have written other than a book. And what I have been paid for my books could buy 2 nice dinners. It's not for money. So yeah, if you want to read an article, do not pay the paywall, do not pay the press. Email the person and say, can I have this? And they are going to give it to you, and you are going to have made their day, and you'll get it for free. You can also just browse academia.edu. There are a lot of people who still keep their... So academia.edu sucks for a lot of reasons, but it hasn't fully in-shitified. And so a lot of people still kind of use it as a repository of their work. And so sometimes you can find that without even having to email them. But yeah, the email is always nice. Yeah. And other than that, if one person says a thing, one person has said a thing. If 2 people say a thing, well, did they get at this same thing independently? Do they have something that they're citing? Then, that's another thing where you can say like, that's a little bit of a crackpot test. If multiple people agree about a thing, it is more likely that it's not insane or flat out wrong than a single thing that appears one place.
Well, that's actually good to know because a lot of my research for my panels were all independent on my own. And then when I find someone does a video essay later or even watching your panel, it's like, oh, just confirms what I was looking at. So
yeah. I when I saw your TF panel the first time, I was just like, this is great. I love that like Bash, like this is a quality panel, your research is good, your presentation is great. Like you obviously have like polished it and poured tons of work into it. So yeah, you're an example of somebody who I would have to say to a student, like, you can't cite Bash, but Bash is right. So yeah, video essays, again, it's one of those like, yeah, if you get confirmation from multiple things, go for it. That's nothing is a guarantee. Even when you get a peer-reviewed thing, like I might be wrong about lots of things, and it is the nature of this kind of work and this kind of topic that there's rarely an actual definitive right answer. So just because something's peer-reviewed doesn't mean that it's accurate. And just because something isn't doesn't mean it isn't. But yeah, you just kind of guess. Also, just the sniff test. Does that sound right? Does that sound weird? Sometimes it's because shit is weird, right? But right, like if you heard from a rando on the street, hey, werewolves piss on their clothes to make sure that nobody steals them and traps them in wolf form forever. That sounds crazy. That is not part of the werewolf tradition in general. But it is a thing. So sometimes the sniff test doesn't work, but sometimes if you can just say like, okay, in the context of this world, in the context of this culture, does that make sense? Sure.
Well, taking it back to TF, I noticed the prevalence of donkey transformation in the Greco-Roman world. Is there a kind of reason for this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short
Great question.
answer,
Great question. Great question.
Yes.
I asked it just for you.
Actually, so Azel went on my Boston Museum tour once, and he could probably just give the answer for me. But I'm not going to put him on the
Oh
spot.
gosh. Oh gosh. Don't do that.
Yeah. So, so there is an answer. So the answer is that so all gods in the Greco-Roman pantheon have, or most gods in the Greco-Roman pantheon are associated with at least one animal, and it's basically their persona. It's not that they transform into it, but it becomes symbolically significant and representative of them. When you see that animal, that's what you've got, right? If anybody has ever seen Hercules: The Legendary Journeys with terrible Kevin Sorbo, or Xena Warrior Princess with wonderful Lucy Lawless, right? Anytime Juno is intervening, you see a peacock feather get overlaid over the screen. And the peacock is Juno's bird. So anytime you see a peacock in a Greco-Roman context, or even in a context that might be related to it in some way, that's telling you like, okay, Juno stuff is going on here. So the donkey is the animal of Dionysus, of Bacchus, who is the god of wine. He's also the god of sort of anti-civilization. He's the god of freedom. He's the god of freeing you from the constraints of cultural norms, the constraints of your everyday norms, the constraints of living in a city. So he's often also associated with the wilderness and with animals. And yeah, his animal is the donkey. The donkey is just kind of so the donkey is a work animal and is omnipresent in vineyards where grapes are being collected and processed into wine. So part of it is just a factual, like there's a strong association with the actual animal and things that are associated with Dionysus. And then some of it is just the traits of the donkey are seen as being the traits of Dionysus, right? So like that stubbornness, that inability to fully control them, that's drunkenness, right? That is the freedom that Dionysus gives you. And Greeks and Romans both think about wine as being a pretty strong TF trigger / trigger for pulling you out of normality. So as you drink wine, right, you become a little bit tipsy and you start leaving behind your rational world and you start entering a world that is freer, that is not constrained, right? So you might be, your speech might be freer, your behavior might be freer. And so at these dinner gatherings, these drinking gatherings that are called symposia in Greece and called convivia in Latin, in Rome, people would drink wine, and often the wine bottles are they have animal stuff on them. They often have donkey things on them. Sometimes they're donkey shaped, and when you drink the wine, when you pull it up to your mouth, you put the donkey face in front of you, and it's you're basically putting on a mask and you're turning yourself into a donkey because you're dedicating yourself to Dionysus. You're turning yourself into his animal. Yeah, so that is a long short answer for
Alien.
why donkeys. Definitely that is a huge component. Is just the Dionysiac element, and Dionysus is a huge transformation deity. Dionysus creates dolphins out of people. There's a fun story where Dionysus is attacked by pirates, and the pirates capture him and have him on ship. And Dionysus is playing along for a little bit, and eventually he says, like, okay, like this was cute, but you're gonna let me go now. And the pirates just kind of abuse him and say, we're not. What are you gonna do? And then he reveals himself as Dionysus, and they all freak out. And he just punishes them by turning them into dolphins, and they jump into the sea and become dolphins forever after. There's a great vase in, I think, the British Museum that shows the pirates in various forms, various moments of transformation. So some of them are fully dolphin, some of them have human legs still, and they've got dolphin tops. Some of them you can see like it's just starting to happen. And there's one that's there's like a dolphin bottom and a human top. So just like a fun, you can see all it's almost like a Animorphs kind of moment.
It looks like we have some questions in the chat as
Oh,
well.
yeah.
So
Yeah, sure. So let's see. So level 5 virus. I got a question I wanted to ask the other chat. Any info on the Chimera-like TFs or anything within that? It's one of those things I love getting Chimera TFs, but is it really mythological if I'm just making a hodgepodge of random animals I like? I mean, all right. Greeks and Romans love they love animals made up a bunch of different animals. Or mythological creatures made of a bunch of different animals, and they love playing like Legos with them. And so, in terms of like, are you being authentically mythological? Yeah, that is the practice. Any animal that you want to put onto another animal, that's the same sort of thing that they're doing. Sometimes you're going to do exactly the same thing that they're doing, or you're in the ballpark. There are bee ladies, people with bee bodies but lady heads. There are Capricorns, goatfish. So lots of different variety, lots of different, what we would think of as falling under the broad category of chimeras. Chimera is, in Greece and Rome, a specific creature. It's one particular mythological animal that has a snake head, a goat head, and a lion head. There's a beautiful archaic bronze statue that is in Rome today. It's in the Etruscan National Museum, which is just north of the center of the city, and it is it's called the Chimera of Arezzo. So it was found in Arezzo, in ancient Arretium, and it's just a great depiction of it. If you Google putting it in the chat. If you Google Chimera of Arezzo, you'll find it instantly. Keep doing what you're doing. It is very difficult to, when it comes to mythology, say whether something is authentic or not, right? Like Greeks and Romans don't think about mythology as capable of having authenticity or capable of having stability. They will tell 5 different versions of the same story, and what they're doing is not saying, okay, one of these is right, and I'm just trying to figure out which one. What they generally do is say, all of these are right? All of these, even the ones that are mutually exclusive, that they do not allow each other to exist, they just do it. So there's a fun thing where like Ovid gives us a bunch of explanations for why the Luperci in Lupercalia run around naked sometimes. And it's just, at one point he just has like, why not give you a Roman explanation too, besides the Greek ones I've already given you, because Roman stuff is neat. He has an idea of back then. So I see, so Simul has a question. My understanding is that wine back then often had congeners and other non-grape ingredients, and that in certain cases there might be reason to suspect there was effects in addition to alcohol intoxication. So the short answer is, there are situations where there are contaminants, where wine is bad. There are types of wine that sometimes are sort of designed to be that, but Greeks and Romans are excellent vintners. They know what they're doing, and this is a trade that they have perfected. So in general, like when they produce wine, they get it right, and the number of bad batches that could poison you or have weird additives is going to be preposterously low. I can't think of a major story where that happens.
Maybe just to contextualize that a bit more, I think when you were speaking about wine kind of bringing you out or bringing you back, I forget the exact wording you used, but I was wondering, and I don't know if this is your precise area of interest or not, but there's been a bit of popular scholarship more recently on the Eleusinian mysteries and like what is this component in the Kikion here, and I was just wondering if you maybe had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, gotcha. So nothing. I'm not an expert on Eleusis. That's outside of my general time range. There is some interesting there's some interesting work being done on hallucinogenics, and that might be part of some interesting things. There is, like Greeks and Romans have access to drugs.
Hallucinogenics, you say?
Continue.
Yes. Yeah. So there's, they have access to some drugs. They don't have pot. They don't have, they don't have LSD. They don't have coke, but they maybe are using mushrooms in some cases. There are two scholars that argue this. One of them, I cannot remember his name, but he writes really bad poetry on the side. And he's retired now and lives in Wisconsin somewhere. And the other one I just can't remember at all. So there is some possible stuff, possible other stuff there. One interesting thing about the Greek and Roman practice of wine is, in general, getting drunk is seen as being a very un-Greek and un-Roman thing to do. And a consequence of that is that Greeks and Romans almost never drink wine that is straight. They water their wine down severely. Sometimes the ratio is 1-3. Sometimes the ratio is 1-9 wine to water. So you're basically getting to, I don't know, like Natty Light territory, or like, it's low alcohol. It's not quite O'Doul. You can still get drunk on it. There's a fun poem by a fragment named Epicharmus who says, is to kind of loosen you up. The second one is for health, and the third one is for sexiness. And if you're drinking after that, then you're outside of what Dionysus wants you to do. He doesn't want you to fully lose control. In general, drunkenness and drinking straight wine is seen as being a sort of a barbaric, literally it is a thing that barbaroi, that foreigners are doing. So sometimes we do have depictions of, people are getting drunk in ancient Greece and Rome. That happens all the time. The idea that you don't get drunk is a conservative, aristocratic, landowning, upper class idea. It's not an every person idea. That is true of most of the things that we have knowledge of. We know what the aristocratic class and what the citizen class does. Relatively much less what everybody else is doing.
Mm-hmm.
So we do see drunkenness. We do see the term for this. And there's a religious term called enthusiasmos, which is having the spirit of the god in you. And ecstasy, ecstasis, is a standing out from your body. It's a leaving your body and being in some other realm, some other kind of frame of reference. And those are really strongly associated with not only wine, but with Dionysus and with prophetic things, right? Prophets often kind of have the god enter them, and then they're no longer purely human. They transform into a mouthpiece for the deity. So that's a bad rambling answer. I'm sorry that I can't give you more or better stuff.
No worries. I think, is it Robert Graves maybe that you were thinking of before?
No.
Who's theorizing about the
Graves is a fun sort of pop writer, and is generally good. But there's a Graves' career was not primarily a research career. It was a much more of a he's the Bill Nye of classics, I guess.
I understand totally what you mean.
Like, he's trained. He's not wrong. But it's about public communication much more. So.
Yeah. Totally.
I know I encouraged Azel. So in the chat, I encouraged Azel to steal the Donkey Cup from the museum. I said I'd have his back, but just did not take me up on the offer. And those are great pictures. Thanks so much for sharing those.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Actually, more curious to hear more about what they were doing for the Festival of Lycia, like what rituals were going on. I think there were supposed to be some modern practices there, but I'm not sure if that's accurate to what they were practicing back then.
I don't know about modern practice. So, so the town of Lucasora is an archaeological site today, and a small farming community. It has a museum. That's where the Veil of Despoina, where the statue of Despoina is. And all of the terracotta figurines are in the barn of a rando farmer, and he and his family refuse to allow anybody to see them. So they have only a handful of them have been photographed one time. And Lycosora was bombed during World War II. So we think actually a lot of these have been destroyed. Yeah, so the Lycaea Festival, what I gave you is a lot of what Pausanias tells us. So there is also a practice of walking over fire that may or may not be TF connected, or may or may not be related to the purification of the purification stuff that we see associated with wolves and abstention from human flesh. I'm trying to think other things that I remember about the Lycaea. Nothing's jumping out to mind right now. Those are the things that we looked at are the major wolfy things. There's something about this is not the festival itself, but there's something about somebody preserves the punishment for violating the sanctity of the precinct of Zeus Lycaeus, but I can't remember what that is or who that is.
So just curious, when they have Zeus Lycaeus, is he actually portrayed as an anthropomorphic wolf, or is it just a name to give to Zeus?
That's a great question. So he is never portrayed as an anthropomorphic wolf. Zeus often becomes an animal, but he is never an anthropomorphic animal. He always becomes a swan, effectively, or a bull, or something like that. It's just other people that he turns into things. And so Lycaeus, in that context, so these are things called epithets, and an epithet is a little bit of information that's attached to a god's name by Greeks and Romans to indicate either the particular category of behavior or influence that you want to invoke at this point. So, like, if your wife is giving birth and you want to make a sacrifice to make the labor go as smoothly as possible, you wouldn't try to pray to Juno Regina, Juno in her incarnation as the queen of the gods, even though she is always the queen of the gods. You would pray to Juno Lucina, the Juno of the Grove, or the Juno of Light, who has this association with the Lupercalia. So sometimes they use it just as almost like the second line in an address, in street address. So I'm sending this one to Zeus, which Zeus, PO Box 2750. Zeus, Jupiter Stator, Jupiter, the guy who stops bad people from coming at you. Sometimes some sources think that the different epitheted gods are distinct from each other, but they are facets of a single idea or single divinity.
Those are like different avatars, like different Hindu tradition.
Yep. Similar in to the Hindu tradition. Yep, absolutely. And then some people talk about them as being entirely different things. So like every different Jupiter is a different Jupiter. So if anybody has watched the Red American Gods, the scene in the final episode of season 1, when we are at Easter's house and we see that there are like 500 Jesuses, that is basically the equivalent of what these ancient authors talk about. The idea that, like, okay, they're all Jesus, but they're all a different Jesus. And yeah, sometimes we know what the epithet means, and or we know what the deity is most strongly associated with when they're invoked with that epithet. Sometimes we just have no idea. So like an interesting thing about the Juno and her goat stuff, there is a Juno Caprimolga. There's a Juno goat word of some sort, maybe goat milker. We do not know what exactly goat stuff has to do with her in that context. We don't know. And Ovid is sometimes our only source for these epithets, and he's just like, we don't know. Who knows? Good luck.
Okay, so there wouldn't be like a statue or an engraving of just a wolf that's supposed to represent Zeus in wolf form that they would pray to or worship.
Yeah. Nope.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. The statue, the horse-headed statue of Demeter Malina, is highlighted by Pausanias as being a really unique thing. In general, when deities have an animal head and a human body, or when they're a little bit more on the anthropomorphic end of things rather than the zoomorphic end of things, often Greeks and Romans think about that as being either really ancient or really foreign. And so, like, Greeks and Romans adopt Egyptian religion in a pretty widespread fashion. In the first century, there's like an Egyptian mania that sweeps over all of Rome. If you're ever at the Pyramide stop on the Rome Metro, it's called the Pyramide stop because there's a big pyramid right next to it. It is not Egyptian. It's just there's a Roman dude named Gaius Cestius who Egypt stuff was hot at the time, and so he was like, I want my tomb to be cool Egypt stuff. And yeah. So your example of Hermanubis, right? So this is a Greco-Egyptian syncretism. It's half Hermes, half Anubis. And this is part of the kind of association of, Hermes is what's called a psychopomp. He's a figure that leads souls to the afterlife. Anubis is also a psychopomp. He leads souls to the afterlife. So they perform a similar function. And eventually they come to form this kind of Voltron different deity, Hermanubis, who's not quite either of them, but is distinct and is worshipped in a different way. And he has a varied form. Sometimes he is dog-headed and human-bodied. Sometimes he is dog-headed and ancient giant-bodied, which doesn't mean that he's big, but it means that he has a forked snake legs that just come out the bottom as like two. It's like the Starbucks mermaid kind of thing. And then sometimes you see Hermanubis represented as entirely human, and then sometimes he's entirely doggy, because Anubis also is sometimes just fully canid. So when we see deities like that, often instantly Greeks and Romans are saying like, okay, that's not our native tradition. That's something that is imported. And yeah, there's a very long but very good article about Roman anti-Egyptian sentiment and how it ties in with Roman religion. There's a huge backlash against Egyptian worship during the Augustan period and during the period of his successor Tiberius. That's a backlash that happens at the top level, at the aristocratic and the imperial level, but Egyptian gods are wildly popular among the lower classes, and so they have to reverse these banishments, and they have to rebuild these temples that Augustus and Tiberius tear down. I love that Hermanubis statue, the first one you got. So that's in the Vatican museums. It's one of the first things that you see when you enter the Greek and Roman section. So he's right there next to a door. I love that. He's kind of psychopomping you. This mosaic right below that is a mosaic from Roman Tunisia. So it's from a place called Deir el Medina. And this probably depicts not a set of anthropomorphic figures, but priests performing roles. So sometimes we see Anubis represented as Anubis. And sometimes we see Anubis represented as a priest who has an Anubis mask on. We have some of these preserved. The figures next to this Anubis priest, are probably they probably have sheaves of wheat. They're probably not donkey ears. Yeah, it is like a race car bed in a lot of ways. Yeah, and I don't. Oh, that's okay. I know the last one. That is on the side of a grave. That's a cool imperial one. And yeah, that's a cool one where you can see like it's the Hermes caduceus. It's the dog head, but it's also palm fronds that are telling you sort of Egyptian-y things, or Near Eastern things. So
it is kind of interesting that they paired Hermes up with Anubis, because you mostly see in classical world, it seems like it's Hermes and Thoth instead of Anubis, but it sounds like they kind of mix and match the gods often.
Yeah, there's a lot of mix and matching. This is that translatio Graeca, translatio Latina, this like trying to figure out what's the closest equivalent, or syncretism, combining things to make a new thing. Romans and Greeks often, like, these are folk traditions that develop, these are religious traditions that develop independently, and sometimes you get sort of patterns that get reinforced, and sometimes you just get you get variety, and the variety is really cool.
I think there was a question you missed earlier where someone was asking, is there a favorite TF story from the classical world that you didn't talk about?
Oh, do I have a favorite TF story from the classical world? So, I mean, I love the Nikros werewolf one. That will always be deep in my heart. There are two great Aesopic fables that are TF stories. So one of them is about a weasel, and the other one is about a fox. And they both have the same pattern. So a god transforms the weasel or the fox into a human woman, and the human woman then is about to get married to either. So one of the stories is the human woman is getting married to Zeus for some reason. The like animal human woman is getting married to Zeus, and the other version is it's just a human that has fallen in love with this animal woman, and doesn't know that she was an animal once upon a time. So that's the weasel one. And at the wedding feast, a mouse runs by, and in both fables, the woman runs off and catches the mouse. And the moral of the story is, you can't change who you are. You are, I am's what I am's, and that's all that I am's. Popeye kind of deal. And it's not a great moral. It's one of these cynic stoic, like, stay in your lane morals. But I just love the kind of comedy of, like, she's still a weasel inside. She's still a fox inside. That didn't go away just because the shape changed. And then Apuleius's Golden Ass, or Metamorphoses, it goes under both titles. That is a perennial favorite of everybody. It is great. I just finished teaching that to my students. So we had 3 days on Apuleius. And the story of Apuleius is about a guy. Story of the Golden Ass is a guy named Lucius is super curious about magic, and he has sex with a serving woman, with an enslaved woman who is a slave in the household of a witch, and convinces this woman that he loves her so that she can sneak him in to watch her mistress use magic to transform, because he's just like a magic tourist. And he watches her transform into an owl, and she flies away. So she's one of these Worsipelles. She's one of the people that term gets applied to. And then he goes up and he wants to, like, rub the transformation ointment on himself. And Pamphili, the girl, tries to stop him, but he's like, no, I just want to check it out a little bit. And then he turns himself into a donkey. And then he has a just endless set of adventures where mostly he either suffers or he watches people suffer. Like, everybody in it is bad. Everybody is a bad character, is a bad person. And there's a lot of just, like, a really cynical worldview in Apuleius. And then in the very end, he is so sad after all of we get to the 10th book and he finally finds one moment of happiness. And the moment of happiness is he is eating food from a human banquet table, and the people at the table just start laughing because they think it's cute that the donkey thinks he's people. And then they say like, oh, let's give him wine. And then they give him wine and the donkey gets drunk and they think it's the most hilarious thing ever. And so they just start they keep dressing him up. They keep, treating him more and more like a person, like a dinner guest. And eventually a Roman aristocratic woman sees this donkey and just falls in love with him. And she pays the guys who own him at the time so that she can have sex with the donkey. And so she gives the money, she goes to the donkey's bedroom that these guys have prepared, and Lucius in donkey form has sex with this aristocratic woman, and he's just like, this was great. Like, finally, I just got to have fun, and nobody had to suffer, and it was great. Like, everybody had a good time. And it's a really interesting... it's hard to get students to have a conversation about this, but it's an interesting question about whether that constitutes bestiality, right? Does a human who happens to be in the form of a horse, who is having sex with a human who thinks she's having sex with an actual horse or donkey, right? Is that bestiality? Like, the intent is bestiality on her side. The reality is he is not. He just looks like a donkey. He doesn't have the mind of a donkey. He doesn't have the experiences of a donkey. So he has one happy moment, and then the happy moment becomes sour because he is then hired out to have sex with a woman who has murdered people, and she's going to be publicly executed. And as part of the public execution, she and the donkey are going to have sex on stage. And he is so just horrified by the idea of A, sleeping with a criminal, and B, being part of an execution that he runs away. He breaks his collar. He runs away. He runs to the shore and he's super, super sad and he's crying. And then the goddess Isis, the Egyptian goddess Isis, appears to him and says, Lucius, I know that you're not a donkey. You've been through a rough time. Go to my festival tomorrow. And the priest there, I've already told to bring TF roses. Go eat the roses and you'll be a human again, and you just have to promise to be part of my cult. You have to worship me and work for me from here on out. And he's just like, that sounds great. And then he basically, the book ends with Lucius is part of a kind of a multi-level marketing scheme for ISIS. And so it is a funny, no learning, no progress. He's still curious. He still sucks.
That's kind of interesting that it's a Greek story, but then they basically have a foreign god that intervenes and saves the day.
Yeah. The Germans call this Das Isis-Buch, the Book of Isis, and it's book 11. So it is weird because of Isis. It is weird that it's a non-Greco-Roman deity that comes to the rescue and is the one who ends everything. It's also weird that it's the 11th book that ends the novel. Greeks and Romans are really careful about numbers, and they're really nitpicky about the numbers that they use in, the number of poems in a book, the number of books that they produce, whatever. And there is nowhere else in all of antiquity a work that consists of 11 chapters, of 11 books. This is the only one. So scholars have tried to figure out, okay, is book 11 fake? Is this added by somebody else? Was there a book 12 and we've lost it and there was more stuff? So hello. And yeah, just really interesting, there's a lot about book 11 that just makes us go, what's going on? Thanks for coming, Woodnote. Thanks so much. So that's a fun story. Pick up a copy of Apelles' Golden Ass. You won't regret it. Don't worry about the details. Just focus on the kind of big picture stuff. And it's a fun ride. It's a dark ride sometimes. But yeah, the characters are really interesting. And Lucius is just a lovable idiot a lot of the times. So you just like you kind of feel bad for him, but every time something bad happens to him, you're kind of like, this is fundamentally your fault, both because you did this to yourself as a donkey, but also this particular situation, this is you. There's a fun, much less dark donkey transformation that is informed by the golden ass that's from the 12th century. It's called the Asinarius, or the donkey guy. And it's about a prince who happens to be born in the shape of an anthropomorphic donkey. And he tries to learn courtly behaviors. He tries to play the lyre, play the harp, and he can't because of hooves. And eventually he marries, he's going to marry the king's, this other king's daughter. And then he gets turned into a full human. It's like Beauty and the Beast, right? It's the kind of sad. You could have had a donkey, lady. You could have had a donkey boyfriend. What are you doing? That's a fun story. So we did that to compliment Apuleius this last week. Any other questions?
You glossed over with the Golden Ass that it's the oldest existing Western novel, and it's a donkey TF story. I love that.
Oldest extant full novel in Europe, written by a North African. So our oldest novel is not only a donkey TF novel, it's also a novel written by an African. He's a Roman African. There's a lot of debate about what exactly ethnicity Apuleius was. We don't know. Nobody's going to ever know. And it's really interesting because we do know various things about Apuleius. So it is also the earliest novel written by a guy accused of witchcraft, or a person accused of witchcraft. So Apuleius marries this widow who is wealthy, and she dies, and her kids get really angry because she has left him all of her stuff in the will. And he's this young guy that they think of as like a carpetbagger. And they sue him for bewitching their mother and using wicked magic to take advantage of her. And we have his defense speech in the actual court trial. So it's called the De Magico Suo. It's the speech about his magic. And it is just a really funny, this author was up there, he was accused of being a witch. Part of why he was accused of being a witch was he wrote a lot about witches. He wrote a lot about transformation. He wrote a lot about magic. And this is one of those if you write about witchcraft, you must be a witch. Or, if you write about donkeys, you must be a donkey, kind of things. So yeah, Azel, thank you for rescuing me from missing that important detail.
Very important. There might have been older novels, but this is the one we got, and it's a donkey TF story.
Yeah, so Petronius's Satyricon would predate the Golden Ass by about 70 years, but we don't have most of it, so we can't say we've got this novel. We've got a middle chunk of the novel. So unless book 11 isn't the end, unless there's a book 12, which probably is not true. It actually ends in a way that is very normal for a Greek and Roman work to end, which is very different from how we expect things to end. Greek and Roman works tend to not wrap up any loose strings. They just suddenly end. And they suddenly end on a moment of just what the fuck just happened? Virgil's Aeneid ends with the main protagonist that we have seen throughout being, wise and merciful, just straight up murders a teenager who's begging for his life. The end. That's the end of the story. It is so unsatisfying to Renaissance readers that there is a Renaissance writer who writes a fanfic 13th book of the Aeneid. He's a guy named Mafiaveggio. It's a terrible book. It's a terrible, terrible fanfic. But he just it's the worst. It's it is all of George Lucas's worst instincts to just like fan service everything and to make sure that everything has an explanation. Every minor character gets looped back in. Everything ends happily ever after. Yeah, bizarre.
Speaking of, have you read? There was a new translation of the Golden Ass that came out a few years ago. That
Sarah Rudin's?
Sorry,
Is it Sarah Rudin's?
It's
The
Peter
one with the donkey braying mouth? Oh, no, go ahead.
Peter Singer and Ellen, I think Finkelpearl.
Oh, you haven't seen that one yet.
So they condensed it a little bit. It's not like the full text, and they also added an epilogue where it kind of ends happily ever after.
Oh,
It's like
amazing.
it's like a modern day version of that.
That's fun. That's like, that's weird, but that's fun. I'm gonna have to check that out. I didn't know that.
Yeah, spoilers. Lucius and the woman, I forget her name, they end up getting married and have a donkey sanctuary together to like rescue donkeys. Yeah.
Oh my god, that is a choice. Greeks and Romans do not have a concept of an animal sanctuary or refuge. They barely have a concept of animal rights. So yeah, that's funny. It does sound like a sweet ending. I finally like prefer that ending. Yeah. Any other things? Any thoughts? You don't have to ask a question. You can say if there's something about Greco-Roman stuff or TF stuff you want to talk about. Go for it.
Yeah, do we have any other questions? I think this has been a good continuation. Actually, I guess on the topic of equine, do you know why there's an association with horses and Poseidon? And I'm not sure why there's an association with horses and water, and I think it might be outside your scope, but if there's any connection between the Poseidon horses, the hippocamps, and eventually the Kelpie in Celtic folklore, because water horses seem to be associated with a lot of European culture.
Yeah. So the association of Poseidon and horses. So like why it is that Greco-Roman culture makes that association originally, we have no idea. But the explanation that we're given is that Poseidon invents the horse. That he molds clay into the horse for the first time, and this is his gift to humans. And so like it's his animal. And yeah, so funnily enough, like when you see representations of Poseidon, like his fursona tends to be a horse and tends not to be a fishy thing. Tends not to be. It's not dolphins. It's almost never dolphins. Cupid is dolphins. The god of love often is dolphins for various reasons. But yeah, so so that's the explanation for like why Poseidon and horses. Horses and ocean stuff, I think that's a consequence of just having been associated with Poseidon. It is a really interesting thing, like why it is that Poseidon was chosen as the guy to do that. Is just kind of weird. There's another version where he doesn't invent horses; they already exist. But he like tames them and allows humans to have tamed horses for the first time. And at the moment that he tames them, the gift that he provides is that he hits a rock in Athens, and it splits open and turns into a spring, a water spring. And this spring is called the Hippocrene. It's the horse spring. And this is in the contest between Poseidon and Athena, where they're trying to compete for who's going to be the patron deity of Athens. Athena obviously wins in the end because they call it Athens. And what happens is Poseidon makes this spring for them, but because it's Poseidon, it's a saltwater spring, and so, or it's brackish, so like it doesn't do them much good. Like it's a wonder, but whatever. And Athena invents the olive tree, and so like she provides actually this enormous benefit to humans, and so she gets absorbed as it's called the poietic deity, the god of the city state, or the primary god or the patron god. Yeah, Kelpie stuff, no idea. Kelpies and hippocamps, and Greco-Roman horse stuff. Too far from me. Ooh, well, I think so. Thank you all so much for spending some time with me, for great questions, for giving your Sunday to a really cool event that I happen to be an uncool part of. So go enjoy the rest of it. And like I said at the end, if anybody ever wants to reach out to me for any reason, I'm easy to find on Blue Sky, so tofte.bsky.social. My furry email is toftepaka@gmail.com, and my work email is polt, POLT@bc.edu. All of those are great. So yeah, don't be shy and say hi if you ever see me at a con.
Thank you.
Big thanks again to Bash and for everybody who's organizing and making this happen.